The rain in Chicago didn't fall, it commanded. It lashed against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the Adams Real Estate Group penthouse, a rhythmic drumming that usually soothed Maggie Adams. Today, it sounded like a countdown. Maggie stood with her back to the room, her reflection ghostly against the backdrop of a graying skyline. At 60, she was a masterpiece of discipline, and her cream silk blouse was as crisp as her reputation. The optics, Maggie. We have to talk about the optics. The voice belonged to Arthur Moore, the chairman of the board, and a man who had spent 40 years smelling of expensive scotch and unearned confidence. Maggie didn't turn around. I've delivered a 22% growth margin in a recession, Arthur. My optics are written in green ink. In Chicago? Yes, Arthur countered, his footsteps muffled by the Persian rug. But we aren't dealing with a local firm. We are courting Kim Global. Téjun Kim is a ghost, a traditionalist, and, from what our intelligence suggests, a man who prizes family stability above all else. He's looking for a legacy partner, not a shark who spends her nights alone in a glass tower. Maggie finally turned, her dark eyes narrowing. Are you suggesting that my widowhood is a corporate liability? I'm saying that the board is nervous, Arthur said, leaning against her mahogany desk. They see a woman who hasn't been photographed with a partner since Marcus passed 10 years ago. They see unstable. They see a lack of a soft landing. If you want this merger to go through, you need to show Kim Global that you aren't just a machine. You need to show them a life. I have a life, Maggie snapped. I have 3 charities, a seat on the museum board, and you need a husband, Maggie, or at least the shadow of one. The silence that followed Arthur's departure was heavier than the storm. Maggie hated that he was right. In the high-stakes world of international mergers, the personal was always political. Téjun Kim, the reclusive titan of Seoul, was known to be a man of impenetrable dignity. If he perceived Maggie as a cold, isolated workaholic, he would swallow her company whole rather than merge with it. She sat at her desk and opened a lacquered drawer. She pulled out a small, matte black business card with no name, only a gold-embossed crest and a phone number. Vanguard Domesticities. It was a lifestyle management firm that handled the problems the police or publicists couldn't. They didn't just find bodyguards or chefs. They provided social placeholders. She dialed the number. A woman with a voice like velvet answered on the first ring. Vanguard. How may we curate your life today? This is Maggie Adams, she said, her voice steady despite the prickle of humiliation in her throat. I require a Tier 1 placement, a male companion for a high-level corporate merger. Minimum age, 55. Impeccable pedigree. Knowledge of international trade is a must. He needs to be convincing. We understand perfectly, Miss Adams. We have a candidate who has recently become available. He is sophisticated, bilingual, and accustomed to the highest circles of power. We call him the Professor. I don't need a tutor, Maggie remarked dryly. He won't be tutoring you, Miss Adams. You'll be trying to keep up with him. 3 days later, the rain had cleared, leaving Chicago shimmering and cold. Maggie sat in the corner booth of the aviary, a bar so exclusive it didn't have a sign on the door. She checked her Patek Philippe. 6:59 p.m. At exactly 7 p.m., the door opened. A man stepped in, shedding a charcoal cashmere overcoat with a fluid grace that suggested he'd spent his life in rooms exactly like this one. He was tall, with a posture that spoke of military precision, softened by decades of wealth. His hair was a striking salt and pepper, predominantly silver at the temples, framed by a face that was handsomely weathered, lines of wisdom around the eyes, a firm, decisive jawline. He scanned the room and locked onto her. He didn't hesitate. He walked toward her table, his gait easy and confident. When he reached her, he didn't offer a hand to shake. Instead, he took her hand, bowed his head slightly in a gesture that felt both ancient and devastatingly modern, and pressed his thumb lightly against her knuckles. "Ms. Adams," he said. His voice was a rich, resonant baritone with the faint, elegant lilt of a soul upbringing polished by London or New York. "I believe I am the man you've hired to be the love of your life." Maggie found herself momentarily breathless, a sensation she hadn't felt since her 30s. She pulled her hand back, regaining her composure. "You're late, mister." "Kim," he said, pulling out the chair opposite her. "Téjun. And actually, I'm 30 seconds early. I spent them admiring the way you look when you're preparing for a fight." Maggie felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She had spent her life being the smartest person in the room. Looking into Téjun's deep, knowing eyes, she realized for the first time in 60 years, she might have met her match. "This is a business arrangement, Mr. Kim," she reminded him, her voice professional. "You are a contractor, nothing more." Téjun smiled, a slow, dangerous tilt of the lips. "Of course, Maggie, but the best lies are the ones that feel like the truth. Shall we begin our history?" The air in the Lyric Opera House was thick with the scent of Chanel No. 5, expensive mahogany, and the hushed, nervous energy of Chicago's elite. Maggie Adams stood in the foyer, her hand resting, perhaps a bit too stiffly, on the charcoal-clad arm of the man she had met only 48 hours prior. "Relax, Maggie," Téjun murmured, his voice a low vibration near her ear. He didn't look at her. He was busy nodding with practiced grace to a passing judge. "If you grip my arm any tighter, the board members will think you're taking me into custody, not a night of Verdi." Maggie forced her fingers to loosen. She was wearing a floor-length gown of midnight navy silk that draped over her 60-year-old frame like liquid armor. "I'm not used to being handled, Mr. Kim. In public, I am Téjun, your husband of 5 years, a retired professor of international relations who now consults for NGOs," he reminded her, his tone smooth as aged bourbon. "And you aren't being handled. You are being supported. There is a difference." As they moved toward the grand staircase, Arthur Moore appeared, his eyes narrowing as he scouted for a weakness. He looked Téjun up and down, searching for the telltale signs of a rented companion. A nervous tic, a suit that didn't fit quite right, a hollow gaze. He found none. Téjun's suit was bespoke, likely Savile Row, and he carried himself with the weary nonchalance of a man who had seen the world and found it slightly underwhelming. "Maggie," Arthur beamed, though his eyes remained cold, "and this must be the elusive husband we've heard so little about." Téjun stepped forward, extending a hand. His grip was firm, his smile perfectly calibrated. "Téjun Kim, forgive my absence from the circuit, Arthur. Academic life in Seoul and London kept me occupied, and frankly, Maggie is the only part of Chicago business I find truly fascinating." The compliment was so deftly delivered, half shield, half flirtation, that Maggie felt a genuine flush creep up her neck. "A professor?" Arthur eyebrow arched. "How quiet for a woman like Maggie." "The loudest minds are often the quietest souls, Arthur," Téjun replied with a wink that suggested a shared, intimate secret. "Now, if you'll excuse us, my wife has a penchant for being in her seat before the first note." Inside the darkened box, the world narrowed. The swells of the orchestra rose, filling the gilded space, but Maggie found she couldn't focus on the stage. She was hyper-aware of the man sitting inches from her. Téjun didn't watch the opera like a man playing a part. He watched it with a deep, melancholy appreciation. When the soprano hit a particularly haunting high C, Maggie saw his jaw tighten. "You aren't a professor," she whispered under the cover of the music. Téjun didn't turn his head. "For tonight, I'm whatever you need me to be." "You know too much about the way Arthur looks at a balance sheet. You didn't just consult for NGOs. You have the eyes of a man who has ordered strikes, corporate or otherwise. Téjun finally turned to her. In the dim, reflected light of the stage, his silver hair shimmered, and his dark eyes seemed to hold a century of secrets. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers on the velvet armrest before finally settling. His skin was warm, his touch grounding. "And you," he whispered, "are a woman who has spent so long building walls that you've forgotten how to let someone hold the door open for you. If we are going to convince the world we are in love, Maggie, you have to stop looking at me like a puzzle to be solved and start looking at me like a man you've chosen." He leaned in closer, his breath ghosting against her cheek. It was a masterclass in performance, or so she told herself. But when his fingers laced through hers, she didn't pull away. The chemistry was no longer a tactical maneuver. It was a physical weight, a pull of gravity that made the 20-story drop of the opera house feel like a leap they were taking together. "Tell me something real," she challenged, her voice trembling slightly. "One thing about the real Téjun Kim." He was silent for a long moment, the music reaching a thunderous crescendo. "I hate the opera," he admitted, his lips twitching into a real, boyish grin that shaved 10 years off his face. "But I would sit through 1,000 of them just to see the way the light hits your profile when you're thinking." Maggie's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, youthful rhythm she thought had died with her husband. She looked back at the stage, her hand firmly entwined with his, terrified by how much she wanted the lie to be true. The rain returned to Chicago, but tonight it felt less like a command and more like a shroud, cocooning Maggie's penthouse in a silver blur. Inside, the lights were dimmed to a warm amber. On the Italian leather sofa lay a spread of documents, legal dossiers, forged wedding certificates, and a timeline of affection, drafted by the agency. Maggie sat with a glass of neat scotch, her feet tucked under her, a rare departure from her usual armored posture. Across from her, Téjun had discarded his suit jacket. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that were lean and corded with muscle. "We met in London," Maggie recited, her voice a bit weary. "A rainy afternoon at the Tate Modern. You were looking at a Rothko, and I told you it looked like a sunset in a coal mine." Téjun looked up from a folder, his dark eyes tracking the movement of her glass. "And I replied that I preferred the coal mine to the sunset. It's a good story, Maggie, but it's sterile." He set the folder aside and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. The professional professor mask was gone, replaced by something heavier, something more resonant. If Arthur Moore corners me in a smoking room, he won't ask about the Tate. He'll ask what you look like when you've had a nightmare. He'll ask how you take your coffee when you're grieving. We need the blood in the veins of this lie. Maggie stiffened. "My grief is not part of the contract." "Then the contract will fail," Téjun said softly. "Tell me about Marcus." The name hit her like a physical blow. She hadn't spoken his name to anyone but her lawyer in 3 years. She looked away, toward the rain-slicked glass. "Marcus was steady," she began, her voice cracking before she steadied it. "He was the architect who designed the foundations I built my towers on. When he died 10 years ago, the silence in this apartment was so loud I couldn't sleep for a year. I buried myself in the Adams group because the bricks didn't cry back. I became a machine because machines don't feel the vacancy of a king-sized bed." She turned back to him, her eyes shimmering with a defiant heat. Is that enough blood for you?" Téjun didn't flinch. He didn't offer a platitude. He simply nodded, his expression one of profound, quiet recognition. "The silence," he murmured. "It's the heaviest thing in the world, isn't it?" "And you?" Maggie challenged, desperate to shift the weight. "The agency said you were available. A man like you doesn't just fall out of the sky into a companion service without a shadow trailing him. Where is your family stability, Téjun?" Téjun reached for the decanter, pouring himself a small measure. He stared into the amber liquid as if it were a crystal ball. "I have 2 sons and a daughter," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "They are successful, brilliant, and they haven't spoken to me in 5 years. I spent their childhoods building a kingdom, one I thought I was building for them. But a king is rarely a father. I miss the recitals for the board meetings. I miss the heartbreaks for the hostile takeovers." He let out a short, dry laugh that didn't reach his eyes. When their mother died, they realized they didn't actually know the man sitting at the head of the table. They saw a monument, not a man. So, they left the monument behind. "I am a billionaire in 3 currencies, Maggie, and I am the most disposable person in my own bloodline." The confession hung in the air, thick and suffocating. For the first time, Maggie didn't see a contractor. She saw a mirror. At 60, they had both reached the summit of their respective mountains, only to find the air was too thin to breathe alone. Téjun stood up, moving slowly toward her. He didn't stop until he was standing directly over her. He reached down, not for her hand this time, but for the glass she was clutching too tightly. He set it on the coffee table and then, with a tenderness that felt like a transgression, he tucked a stray silver lock of hair behind her ear. "We are very good at being powerful, Maggie," he whispered, "but we are terrible at being seen." Maggie looked up at him, her breath hitching. The backstory was forgotten. The merger was a world away. In this quiet, expensive tomb of an apartment, 2 ghosts were suddenly, terrifyingly alive. "Téjun," she breathed, a question and a plea all at once. He didn't answer with words. He sat beside her, his shoulder pressing against hers, providing a warmth that the scotch couldn't touch. For the rest of the night, they didn't study the folders. They talked about the things they had lost, forging a connection that was far more dangerous than any corporate lie. The gold room of the Blackstone Hotel was a cathedral of excess. Gold-leafed ceilings, crystal chandeliers that wept light, and the muffled roar of Chicago's most powerful people. This was the pre-merger gala, the final hurdle before the signatures that would fuse Adams Real Estate with Kim Global. Maggie felt Téjun's hand at the small of her back. It was a proprietary touch, steady and warm through the thin silk of her backless champagne gown. To anyone watching, they were the embodiment of legacy. 2 titans who had found their harbor in one another. "Smile, Maggie," Téjun leaned in, his lips brushing her temple. "The vultures are circling, and they're looking for a crack in the foundation." "I'm smiling, Téjun," she whispered back, her heart performing a treacherous flutter. "I'm also wondering if I've ever actually felt this safe in a room full of enemies." It wasn't a lie. Over the last few weeks, the professor had become her confidant. They had spent late nights over takeout Thai and vintage Bordeaux, dismantling the barriers of their 60 years. She had told him things she hadn't even told Marcus, her fear of irrelevance, her secret love for jazz piano, the way the wind sounded at the top of a half-finished skyscraper. She was falling. It was a terrifying vertical drop, and for the first time in her life, she didn't want to catch herself. As they moved through the crowd, Téjun was a masterclass in social engineering. He charmed the wives of the board members with stories of Seoul's hidden gardens and debated trade tariffs with the skeptical CFOs. He was the perfect asset. But beneath the bespoke charcoal vest of his tuxedo, a small, high-frequency transmitter hummed against his ribs. "Maggie, darling." Arthur Moore intercepted them, looking flushed from too much champagne. "The board is impressed. Your husband has a way of making us all feel like we're in a graduate seminar. Tell me, Téjun, what's your take on the Kim Global acquisition of the Southside waterfront? Maggie thinks it's a gamble." Maggie stiffened. That was a private thought she'd shared with Téjun over coffee this morning. A strategic vulnerability. Téjun didn't miss a beat. He laughed softly, a sound that drew nearby investors closer. "Maggie is a perfectionist, Arthur. She calls it a gamble because she hasn't seen the logistics I've looked at. Between us, the waterfront isn't a gamble. It's the anchor of the whole deal. If Kim Global secures that, they don't just own the land, they own the access. Arthur's eyes lit up. He began to divulge the board's secret concerns about the zoning laws, leaning in close to the professor. Maggie watched them, a warm glow of pride in her chest. She saw Téjun nodding, his expression one of rapt, supportive attention. She felt a surge of affection so sharp it was almost painful. I could do this, she thought. I could actually live this life with him when the contract ends. An hour later, Maggie stepped away to the ladies' lounge to compose herself. The reflection in the mirror was that of a woman she barely recognized. Eyes bright, cheeks flushed, the lioness of Chicago, looking softened by the touch of a man she'd hired. Meanwhile, in the shadows of a velvet-curtained alcove, Téjun adjusted his cufflink. It wasn't a cufflink. It was a microphone. He tapped a hidden earpiece. I have the zoning projections, he said, his voice cold, stripped of the warmth he had used on Maggie moments before. Vance gave up the board's red line for the south side. They're desperate. We can squeeze another 5% out of the valuation before we move for the hostile takeover. A voice crackled in his ear. And the woman? Adams? Téjun looked through the gap in the curtains, catching sight of Maggie as she re-entered the ballroom. She was looking for him, her eyes searching the crowd with the vulnerability that made his chest ache with a phantom limb of guilt. He saw her touch the necklace he had given her, a prop for the night, with a lingering, tender finger. She's exactly what we thought, Téjun said, his jaw tightening until it hurt. A liability. She's let her guard down. The intel is gold. He cut the connection. He stepped out of the shadows and intercepted her, catching her hand and spinning her into a slow dance as the orchestra began a low, sweeping waltz. Where did you go? She asked, her voice breathless as she rested her head against his shoulder. Just making sure our future is secure, Maggie, he lied, his hand pressing into her back, feeling the heat of her skin through the silk. As they swayed, Maggie closed her eyes, leaning into the man she believed was her savior. She didn't feel the cold metal of the recorder against his chest. She only felt the heartbeat of her greatest rival, counting down the seconds until her world exploded. The rain had finally ceased, leaving Chicago's skyline sparkling like a spilled jewelry box. Inside Maggie's penthouse, the silence was no longer heavy or mourning. It was charged. A high-voltage wire hummed between the two figures standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows. The gala was over. The heels were off. The ties were loosened. But the performance hadn't ended, and that was the problem. We did it, Maggie said, her voice barely a whisper. She held a glass of water, her fingers trembling slightly. The board is unanimous. The merger papers are being printed as we speak. By tomorrow morning, Adams Group and Kim Global will be one entity. Téjun stood a few feet away, his silhouette sharp against the city lights. He didn't look like a victor. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, calculating the wind speed before a fall. You've won, Maggie, he said. His voice was sandpaper and velvet. You saved your legacy. We saved it, she corrected, stepping closer. The air between them fractured. I couldn't have navigated those sharks without you. You didn't just play a role, Téjun. You saw them. You saw me. She reached out, her hand hovering before landing on his chest, right over the spot where the recorder had been hours before. It was gone now, tucked away with the rest of his deceptions, but his heart was thundering beneath her palm. It was the only honest thing in the room. Téjun looked down at her. At 60, Maggie Adams was more beautiful than any ingenue he had ever known. Her beauty wasn't a mask. It was a map of a life lived with ferocity. He felt a wave of self-loathing so sharp it turned his stomach. He was the wolf she had invited into the sheepfold, and he was currently falling in love with the shepherd. Maggie, he rasped, his hands coming up to frame her face. His thumbs traced the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, lines he had caused her to create with her laughter over the past weeks. There is so much you don't know about the service, about why I'm here. I know enough, she murmured, tilting her head into his touch. I know how I feel when you walk into a room. I know that for the first time in 10 years, the silence doesn't hurt. Don't talk about the contract, not tonight. She stood on her toes and kissed him. It wasn't the tentative, scripted kiss of a fake couple. It was desperate. It was the collision of two people who had spent decades being the adult in the room, the pillar of the community, the CEO. It was raw and unpolished. Téjun groaned into her mouth, his hand sliding down to her waist, pulling her flush against him. He wanted to drown in her. He wanted her to be his penance and his prize. They moved toward the bedroom, a slow, tangled dance of silk and skin. In the dim light of the bedroom, stripped of their titles and their armor, the age between them didn't feel like a burden. It felt like an achievement. Their bodies told stories, scars of old surgeries, the softening of skin that had weathered storms, the strength of muscles that had carried empires. When they finally came together, it wasn't a frantic burst of youth, but a deep, rhythmic shattering. It was the kind of intimacy that only comes when you realize how little time you have left to waste. Afterward, as Maggie lay tucked into the crook of his arm, her breathing evening out into the heavy rhythm of sleep, Téjun stayed awake. He looked at the woman he was about to ruin. I can tell her, he thought. I can tell her right now. We can call off the hostile takeover. We can find another way. He opened his mouth to speak, the truth burning in his throat like bile. Maggie, I am Téjun Kim. I'm the man across the table. I intercepted your call because I wanted to destroy you. But then, Maggie shifted in her sleep, murmuring his name with a trust that broke his heart. If he told her now, he would see that light extinguish. He would see the lioness turn to ash. He closed his eyes, a single tear escaping to vanish into the expensive silk pillowcase. He couldn't do it. Not here. Not in the sanctuary of her bed. He would wait for the boardroom. He would let the business world be the stage for her execution. Because even as he loved her, the tiger of soul knew that in their world, power was the only thing that lasted, and he was about to take hers. The morning was too bright. The Chicago sun bounced off the glass of the Adams Group Plaza with a clinical, unforgiving glare. Maggie Adams stepped out of her town car, her stride a symphony of power. She was dressed in a suit of winter white, the color of a queen claiming her throne. Around her neck sat the pearl strand Marcus had given her, but on her finger, she still wore the simple gold band the agency had provided. She hadn't taken it off this morning. She didn't think she ever would. You look radiant, Maggie, Arthur Moore said, meeting her in the lobby. He looked smug, his chest puffed out like a pigeon. The lawyers are all upstairs. It's a historic day. Where's the husband? I thought he'd want to see his wife's crowning achievement. Téjun had some errands to run, Maggie said, her voice smooth, though her heart did a soft, warm roll at the mention of his name. He'll join us for the signing. He promised he wouldn't miss it. They ascended in the private elevator. Maggie checked her reflection in the polished brass. She looked like a woman who had it all, an empire saved, and a man who understood the marrow of her soul. The memory of his touch last night was a secret warmth against the chill of the air conditioning. The double doors to the grand boardroom were opened by two silent assistants. The room was a sea of dark suits. On the left side sat the Adams Group Board, her people. On the right side sat the legal team for Kim Global, a row of stone-faced men and women who had flown in from Seoul. The seat at the head of the table, the seat reserved for the CEO of Kim Global, was turned toward the window. All she could see was the back of a high-backed leather chair and the crown of a head with familiar silver-streaked hair. "Ah," Arthur whispered, "the man of mystery. He's actually here." Maggie felt a surge of professional adrenaline. She walked to her side of the table, her heels clicking with rhythmic authority. "Gentlemen, ladies," she addressed the room, "let's not keep history waiting. I am Maggie Adams, and I am ready to finalize the partnership between our firms." The leather chair creaked as it began to rotate. "A partnership, Maggie?" The voice hit her like a physical blow. It wasn't the voice of the professor. It wasn't the warm, melodic baritone that had whispered her name against her skin 6 hours ago. This voice was cold. It was the sound of a steel blade sliding out of a scabbard. The chair finished its turn. Maggie's breath left her body in a silent rush. Sitting in the seat of her greatest rival was the man she had shared her bed with. He was dressed in a sharp suit, his posture no longer that of a supportive spouse, but of a monarch surveying a conquered territory. "Téjun," she whispered, the name sounding like a plea in the cavernous room. He didn't stand. He didn't smile. He looked at her with an expression of detached, clinical interest. Behind him, his COO placed a thick stack of documents on the table. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding, Ms. Adams," Téjun said. He didn't use the name Maggie. He didn't even use the name wife. "I'm not here to sign a partnership. I'm here to finalize the absorption." "What are you talking about?" Arthur Moore stammered, looking between them. "Maggie, I thought—" "I am Téjun Kim," he said, his eyes locked onto Maggie's pale face, "CEO of Kim Global, and I believe you've spent the last week giving me exactly the leverage I needed to realize your company is undervalued and over-leveraged." The room went into a tailspin of whispers, but Maggie stayed frozen. The world was tilting on its axis. She looked at his hands, the hands that had held her so tenderly, and saw him calmly unscrewing the cap of a fountain pen. "You—" Her voice was a ghost of itself. "The agency, the professor, it was all you." "I don't leave my investments to chance," Téjun said. He leaned forward, the sunlight catching the predatory sharpness of his gaze. "I heard you were looking for a placeholder. I decided to see for myself if the woman running Adams Group was as formidable as the rumors suggested, or if she was just lonely." The word lonely twisted in her gut like a knife. "You recorded me," she realized aloud, the humiliation beginning to burn through the shock. "Every conversation, every board secret, everything." "It's just business, Maggie," he said, echoing the words she had used on their first night. "You taught me that. Now, if you'll look at Section 4, Paragraph B of the new filing, you'll see that your board has already been outvoted. I own the South Side waterfront. I own your debt. And as of 10 minutes ago, I own this chair." He stood up then, his height towering over the table. For a second, just a flicker, Maggie saw his hand tremble. She saw the ghost of the man who had cried in her arms. But then the mask of the reclusive tiger slammed back into place, harder and colder than before. Maggie stood her ground, though her knees felt like water. She reached out and slowly, deliberately, slid the gold fake wedding band off her finger. She dropped it on the mahogany table. It hit with a tiny, pathetic clink. "You missed one thing in your intel, Téjun," she said, her voice regaining its iron. He arched a silver eyebrow. "And what's that?" "I've survived 10 years of silence," she hissed, leaning across the table until she was inches from his face. "I can survive you. You didn't just buy a company today. You started a war with the only person who knows where your heart is hidden. And I promise you, I will burn your empire to the ground to find it." Téjun stared at her, his pulse visible in his neck. The room was silent. The wow of the betrayal was complete, but as they locked eyes, it was clear that the merger was dead. and the real battle had just begun. The aftermath of the boardroom felt like a crime scene. Maggie stood in the center of her office, the white suit she had worn so proudly now feeling like a shroud. She didn't sit. If she sat, she might collapse, and Maggie Adams did not collapse. Not while the enemy was still in the building. "I want every asset frozen," she said, her voice a low, vibrating hum of controlled rage. "I want an injunction on the waterfront titles. I want a forensic audit of every communication Téjun Kim has had on American soil." Her legal team, a row of frightened but efficient men in gray, nodded frantically. Arthur Moore stood by the door, his face ashen. "Maggie, the board is leaning toward his valuation. He has the debt." "I don't care about the board," she roared, turning on him with a ferocity that made the chairman flinch. "He lied to gain proprietary secrets. He bypassed federal vetting. He turned my life into a reconnaissance mission. I will tie him up in litigation until his hair turns as white as his lies. Now, get out." When the door clicked shut, the silence rushed back in. That familiar, suffocating silence she had described to him. Only now, it was worse. It was haunted by the ghost of his laugh and the phantom warmth of his skin. A knock sounded, not at the main door, but at the private entrance used only by Maggie and her closest advisors. She reached for a heavy glass paperweight, her knuckles white. "If you're a process server, leave it on the floor." The door opened. It was Téjun. He had ditched the tie, and his silver hair was uncharacteristically mussed. He looked less like a titan and more like a man who had just survived a shipwreck. He didn't come in. He stood in the threshold, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her stomach turn. "Get out," she whispered. "Maggie, listen to me," he said, stepping into the room. He closed the door behind him, shutting out the world. "I didn't come here as your rival. I came here because you realized you forgot to bug the flower vases," she spat, her eyes flashing. "Because you wanted to see if the lonely widow was crying yet." "I came here to tell you that I'm pulling the hostile filing," he said, his voice urgent. Maggie froze. "What?" "I told my board an hour ago. I'm stalling the acquisition. I'm citing unexpected legal complexities." Téjun stepped closer, his hands held out as if he were approaching a wounded animal. "The interception. It was supposed to be a game, a way to see who I was dealing with. But the man who sat in that opera house with you wasn't a spy, Maggie. The man who told you about his children. He wasn't a character." "You are a master of the craft, I'll give you that," Maggie said, a bitter, jagged laugh escaping her. "You think I'm going to fall for the sensitive villain routine? You used my husband's memory to get me to lower my guard. You used my bed to steal my company." "I fell in love with you," he shouted, the sound echoing off the glass walls. The silence that followed was deafening. Téjun's chest heaved, his composure finally, utterly broken. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I thought you were just another executive. But you were the first person in 20 years who looked at me and didn't see a threat. You saw me." Maggie felt a pang of something, longing perhaps, but she crushed it under the weight of her fury. She walked up to him until they were inches apart, the same distance they had been when they danced. "You don't know what love is, Téjun," she said, her voice cold and sharp as a diamond. "Love is a foundation. You built yours on a sinkhole of deceit. You didn't fall in love. You fell in love with the power you had over me." "Maggie, if you want to prove you love me, give me back my company and leave Chicago," she challenged. "Go back to your empire and soul and leave me with my lonely life. Because every time I look at you, I don't see the man I spent the night with. I see the man who sat at the head of my table and tried to erase me." Téjun looked at her, and for a moment, the reclusive tiger looked utterly defeated. He realized that in winning the war for her company, he had irrevocably lost the woman. "I won't stop fighting for this," he said quietly. Not for the merger. For us. There is no us, Maggie said, turning her back to him. There is only the Adams Group, and I'm going to make sure it's the one thing you can never have. As he walked away, the sound of his footsteps was the only thing Maggie heard until she was sure he was gone. Then, and only then, did the Lioness of Chicago sit down and let the first tear fall. The office was a war room. Gone were the fresh lilies and the soft jazz. In their place were stacks of paper, glowing monitors, and the cold blue light of 3 a.m. Maggie Adams sat at the center of the chaos, her glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, a third cup of black coffee cooling on her desk. There has to be a crack, she whispered to the empty room. No empire is a monolith. For 3 days, she had ignored Téjun's flowers, his calls, and his legal team's attempts at a settlement. She didn't want a settlement. She wanted a scalp. She had directed her private investigators to dig into the one thing Kim Global prided itself on, its logistics. A ping from her encrypted laptop broke the silence. Her lead auditor, a woman who lived for the thrill of a decimal point out of place, had sent a file labeled The Ghost Fleet. Maggie scrolled through the shipping manifest of Kim Global's North American division. On the surface, it was a flawless stream of commerce, but as she cross-referenced the weight of the containers with the fuel consumption of the vessels, the math stopped making sense. You're lighter than you should be, Maggie murmured, her eyes darting across the spreadsheet. She dug deeper, tracing the digital trail to a shell company based in the Cayman Islands. It was a sophisticated embezzlement scheme, hidden beneath the sheer volume of Kim Global's daily operations. Millions of dollars were being siphoned out of the company every month, diverted from the very merger fund Téjun had been using to pressure her. Then, she saw the signature on the authorization bypass. It wasn't Téjun's. It was his COO's, the man who had stood behind him in the boardroom like a loyal shadow. But the oversight had happened on Téjun's watch. Under the strict corporate laws of his home jurisdiction, this level of negligence wouldn't just result in a fine. It would result in a total forfeiture of assets and a potential prison sentence for the CEO. Maggie leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking in the stillness. She had it. She had the kill switch. If she leaked this to the press or the international regulators, Kim Global would be dismantled by the end of the week. Téjun's reputation, the reclusive tiger whose honor was his shield, would be incinerated. He would lose his company, his legacy, and the very thing he had tried to take from her, his power. The sun began to bleed over the Chicago skyline, painting the room in a bruised purple. Maggie picked up her phone to call the Wall Street Journal. This was the victory she had screamed for. This was the scorched earth. But her thumb hovered over the screen. She looked at the empty space on the sofa where they had sat 3 nights ago, sharing their vulnerabilities like 2 shipwrecked souls. She remembered him talking about his children, how they saw him as a monument, not a man. If she did this, she wouldn't just be winning a corporate war. She would be confirming his children's worst fears. She would be destroying the man who had, however briefly, made her feel seen. She felt the weight of the gold band she had thrown on the table. It had been a lie, but the way she felt when he looked at her, that had been the most honest thing she had experienced in a decade. "Is this what you want, Maggie?" she asked herself, her voice raspy from exhaustion. "Do you want to be the one who pulls the trigger?" She looked back at the screen. The evidence of the embezzlement was damning. She had the power to ruin him, to stand over the ashes of Kim Global and reclaim her throne. But as she stared at the Ghost Fleet documents, she realized that in the game of kings and queens, the most devastating move isn't the one that kills the rival. It's the one that changes the game entirely. She didn't call the press. Instead, she dialed a number she had blocked 48 hours ago. It picked up on the first ring. "Maggie?" Téjun's voice was thick with a hope that pained her. Don't speak, she said, her voice like iron. I'm sending a car for you. We aren't meeting as lovers, and we aren't meeting as partners. We're meeting as two people who are about to lose everything if we don't start telling the truth. The neon sign for the blue note flickered, a dying pulse of sapphire against the rain-slicked pavement of a side street the tourists never found. Inside, the air was a thick, heady cocktail of expensive tobacco, aged rye, and the morning wail of a tenor saxophone. Maggie was already at the back booth, the shadows playing across the sharp lines of her face. She didn't have a bodyguard. She didn't have a briefcase. She only had a manila envelope that felt heavier than a lead box. The bell above the door chimed, and Téjun stepped in. He had traded his power suits for a dark turtleneck and a wool coat, looking less like a titan of industry and more like the man who had sat in the opera house and admitted he hated the music. He spotted her and hesitated, a rare fracture in his composure, before sliding into the booth across from her. "You chose this place," he said, his voice barely audible over the bass line of a jazz standard. "I didn't think you'd ever want to come back here." "I didn't choose it for the memories, Téjun," Maggie said, pushing the envelope across the scarred wood of the table. "I chose it because it's the only place in the city where the walls are too thick for a microphone and the bartender is too old to care who we are." Téjun opened the envelope. As he scanned the shipping manifest and the embezzlement trail, the color drained from his face. The reclusive tiger looked, for the first time, truly hunted. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I know you didn't," Maggie replied, her voice softening despite herself. "If you were the one stealing, you would have been much cleaner about it. This is sloppy. This is the work of someone who thinks you're too distracted by your war with me to notice the back door is wide open." Téjun closed the file and leaned back, rubbing his temples. "My COO. He's been with me for 30 years. He helped me build the first warehouse in Busan." He looked at her, his eyes raw. "Why didn't you leak this? You could have ended me tonight. You could have had the Adams group back by morning." Maggie took a slow sip of her drink, the ice clinking against the glass. "Because at 60, I realized I don't want to win by default. And because—" She paused, the what if hanging in the air like a ghost. "Because the woman who slept in your arms 3 nights ago wouldn't let me." Téjun reached across the table, his fingers stopping just short of her hand. "Maggie, the things I said, about being lonely, about my children. I wasn't playing you. I was finding you." "But you still sat at that table," she countered, her voice trembling. "You still looked me in the eye and tried to take the one thing I had left to my name. You chose the empire over the woman, Téjun. You always do. That's why your children don't call." The words hit him with the force of a physical strike. He winced, drawing his hand back. I thought if I owned it all, I could protect you. I thought I'd never have to leave your side. It was a fool's logic. The logic of a man who only knows how to love through acquisition." They sat in silence for a long time, the saxophone player transitioning into a slow, melancholic ballad. The air was thick with the weight of what they could have been, a power couple built on truth instead of a house of cards. "What happens now?" Téjun asked. "Now," Maggie said, her eyes turning back to Flint, "we stop being enemies, and we stop being lovers. We become survivors. Your COO is moving to oust you, and my board is looking for any excuse to replace me with someone younger and more malleable. They're using our war to destroy us both." Téjun nodded, the CEO returning to his eyes, but tempered by a new, somber clarity. "They want the crown, but they don't want the scars that come with it." "Exactly," Maggie said. She reached out, and this time she was the one to bridge the gap, her hand covering his. Her skin was cool, but her grip was steady. "We're going to give them a show, Téjun. We're going to make them think we're tearing each other apart while we prepare the trap." "And after the trap is sprung?" he asked, his gaze searching hers for a glimmer of the woman from the penthouse. "What is left for us? Maggie looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the man who had intercepted a contract just to meet her. She saw the rival she hated and the man she loved, and for the first time, she couldn't tell them apart. After the trap, she said quietly, we see if there's anything left of the professor and the lioness worth saving. But for tonight, just listen to the music. They sat in the dim blue light, two titans in a crumbling world, holding hands while the jazz played on. The morning after the jazz club, the air in Chicago felt brittle. Maggie sat in her office, not behind her desk, but in the small armchair by the window. She was watching the digital ticker of the stock market crawl across her monitor. Adams Group was dipping. Kim Global was volatile. The door burst open without a knock. Arthur Moore marched in, flanked by two junior partners she didn't recognize. They looked like fresh-faced assassins in tailored wool. Maggie, we've called an emergency closed session meeting for this afternoon, Arthur said, his voice dripping with a faux sympathy that made her skin crawl. The instability of your personal entanglement with Kim has breached your fiduciary duty. We're moving for a vote of no confidence. Maggie didn't blink. She didn't even look at him. You're moving quickly, Arthur, almost as if you've already picked out the upholstery for my chair. We're doing what's best for the legacy, Arthur snapped. Whose legacy? She asked, finally turning her head. Mine? Or the one you've been promised by Kim Global's internal dissidents? Arthur's face went momentarily slack. It was a flicker of hesitation that confirmed everything she and Téjun had theorized in the dim light of the Blue Note. Simultaneously, 40 floors up in the Kim Global satellite office, Téjun sat across from his COO, Minho Park. Minho had been his right hand for 3 decades, a man who had toasted at Téjun's wedding and wept at his wife's funeral. The board and soul is restless, Téjun, Minho said, sliding a tablet across the desk. They see the litigation Maggie Adams has filed. They see the delays. They think you've lost your edge because of a woman. I've been authorized to step in as interim CEO to stabilize the merger. Téjun looked at the tablet. It was a pre-written resignation letter. He looked at Minho and saw not a friend, but a scavenger. You were always better at the shadows than the light, Minho, Téjun said calmly. Did Arthur Moore promise you a seat on the combined board, or just a percentage of the embezzlement you've been hiding in the shipping manifests? Minho's eyes hardened. The mask of the loyal servant dropped. I built this empire while you were mourning or hiding in your study. I deserve more than a thank you in your memoirs. You and Adams are relics. You're playing a game of honor in an age of algorithms. You're out, Téjun. By 5 o'clock, both of you will be footnotes. At 1 p.m., Maggie's private elevator dived to the basement parking garage. Waiting in the shadows of a concrete pillar was a nondescript black SUV. The door opened, and she climbed in. Téjun was inside, a secure laptop open on his knees. He admitted it, Téjun said, his voice a low growl. Minho has been coordinating with Moore for 18 months. They didn't want the merger for growth. They wanted it to create a valuation fog. While our companies are distracted by the fusion, they're going to strip the liquid assets and move them to their offshore shells. Maggie leaned back, the adrenaline of the hunt finally replacing the hollow ache of betrayal. They think we're too busy fighting each other to see them holding the matches. They think our mature emotions have made us weak. They forgot one thing, Téjun said, turning to her. He reached out, his hand grasping hers. This wasn't the touch of a fake husband or a deceptive rival. It was the grip of a soldier in the trenches. We didn't get to 60 by being weak. We got here by surviving people exactly like them. How much time do we have? Maggie asked. The joint board meeting is in 3 hours, Téjun replied. They've called it at a neutral law firm. They think they're going to announce our dual resignations. Maggie looked at the screen, her mind spinning through 3 decades of corporate warfare. They want a show? Let's give them a masterpiece. But we need more than the embezzlement files. We need them to confess on the record. I have the professor's tools still, Téjun said, a faint, dangerous smile touching his lips. He pulled a small, high-frequency transmitter from his pocket, the same kind he had used to record her. I think it's time we used our performative intimacy for a righteous cause. Maggie looked at the device, then at the man she had loved, hated, and was now about to save the world with. Arthur always said my personal life was a liability. Let's show him exactly how much it's going to cost him. They sat in the darkened SUV, heads bent together over the blueprints of a counterstrike, two titans who had finally stopped playing a game of shadows and started building a real fire. The lobby of the Harrington Legal Suites was a gauntlet of flashing bulbs and shouted questions. Maggie Adams marched through the crowd, her face a mask of cold, unyielding marble. Behind her, Tae-Jun Kim exited a separate vehicle, flanked by his own security, his expression equally lethal. Ms. Adams, is it true the merger is dead? Mr. Kim, are the rumors of a hostile takeover true? They didn't look at each other. As they entered the gold-trimmed elevator, the door slid shut on the chaos, leaving them in a sudden, vibrating silence. The moment the light for the 40th floor dinged, Tae-Jun reached out. He didn't grab her hand. He merely brushed his knuckles against hers. Your jaw is too tight, Maggie, he whispered, his voice the only warmth in the stainless steel box. You look like you're going to a morning show. You need to look like you're going to a victory. Maggie let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for a decade. She leaned her head against the cool metal wall. I'm tired of the theater, Tae-Jun. I'm 60 years old. I've spent 40 of those years acting for an audience that doesn't even like me. Tae-Jun stepped closer, closing the space between them. He didn't play the professor now. He didn't play the tiger. He was just a man who had realized, far too late, what actually mattered. We have exactly 60 seconds until these doors open, and we have to hate each other again, he said, his eyes searching hers. I wasted 30 years with Minho thinking loyalty was a line on a ledger. I wasted my children's lives thinking I was building a monument. I don't have another 30 to waste on being right. Maggie looked at him, the silver at his temples, the weary kindness in his gaze. I've spent my life waiting for a man who could outrun me, she admitted, her voice trembling. And then I hired him. And then I tried to sue him into oblivion. Tae-Jun chuckled, a dry, elegant sound. It was a very impressive lawsuit. I don't want to fight you anymore, she said, reaching out to straighten his lapel. I just want to finish this, with you. Tae-Jun took her hand, his thumb tracing the spot where her wedding ring, the fake one she'd discarded, belonged. After today, the world will know we are allies, but right now, we give them the war they paid for. The elevator dinged. The mask slammed back into place. The boardroom was a theater of war. Arthur Moore sat at the head of the table, flanked by Minho Park. They looked like two vultures who had finally cornered the lions. Maggie, Tae-Jun, Arthur said, spreading his hands. We've reviewed the mutual injunctions. The damage to both brands is catastrophic. To save the shareholders, the boards of Adams Group and Kim Global have drafted a joint severance. You both step down, effective immediately. Minho and I will oversee a healing committee to manage the assets. Severance? Maggie spat, slamming her leather portfolio onto the table. The sound made Arthur jump. You think you can kick me out of a building I laid the first brick for? Because of a personal lapse in judgment? It's more than that, Maggie, Minho said, his voice oily. It's about stability. Tae-Jun, you've been compromised. You intercepted a contract for a companion service. It's a scandal waiting to break. We're doing you a favor by letting you retire quietly. Tae-Jun stood up, his height casting a long shadow over Minho. He looked like he was about to strike. A favor? Is that what you call the 5% you've been skimming off the Busan manifests, Minho? Or the kickbacks Arthur's been receiving to ensure the South Side zoning failed? Arthur's face turned a shade of sickly gray. That's a desperate accusation, Téjun. You have no proof. Maggie smiled. It was the smile of the lioness who had finally caught the scent of blood. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, sleek tablet. Actually, Arthur, she said, her voice dropping into a deadly conversational tone, Téjun and I spent the last few hours reconciling our data. You see, when two people of our experience pretend to be in love, they learn a lot about how to keep a secret. And when they actually are in love, they learn how to share them. She tapped the screen. The room's monitors flickered to life, displaying a direct link to a federal server. We aren't here to resign, Maggie said, standing up to join Téjun at the head of the table. They stood shoulder to shoulder, the African-American queen of Chicago real estate and the Korean titan of global logistics. We're here, Téjun added, because we've already invited the SEC and the International Maritime Bureau to this meeting. They're in the lobby, Arthur, and I believe they have some questions about your healing committee. The silence in the room was absolute. Arthur Moore looked at Minho. Minho looked at the door, but there was no escape. Maggie turned to Téjun. For the first time in front of the board, in front of the traders, and in front of the world, she didn't look at him with professional respect. She looked at him with an unapologetic, mature heat. I think we're finished here, don't you, Téjun? Almost, Téjun said. He turned back to the stunned board members. The merger is back on, but the terms have changed. It will no longer be an acquisition. It will be a partnership under new management. As the authorities entered the room to lead Arthur and Minho away, Maggie and Téjun didn't watch the fallout. They walked out of the boardroom together, their hands entwined, leaving the wreckage of their old lives behind to start the only thing they had left, a future. The chaos of the Harrington legal suites had been replaced by a quiet that felt earned. The headlines were a whirlwind. Moore and Park indicted, the silent coup that failed, Adams and Kim, a new era. But inside the Adams Group headquarters, the air was still. The purge had been swift. Maggie had cleared her board of the rot, and Téjun had done the same with the Seoul office via a 3-hour video conference that had left the remaining executives trembling. They had cut out the rot of their companies with the precision of surgeons who had nothing left to lose. Maggie sat at her desk, but for the first time in her career, she wasn't looking at a contract. She was looking at a framed photograph of her and Marcus. She felt a presence at the door and didn't need to look up to know who it was. The scent of cologne and rain preceded him. The press is waiting downstairs, Téjun said. He was dressed in a deep charcoal suit, but he had left the tie off. He looked relaxed. The predatory tension in his shoulders finally eased. The teleprompter has the speech about synergy and logistical optimization. Are we ready to lie to them one last time? Maggie stood, smoothing the front of her cream-colored blazer. No more lies, Téjun. Not today. The lobby was a sea of microphones and camera lenses. Maggie and Téjun walked out together, not in the staged, rigid formation of the gala, but with the easy, synchronized rhythm of two people who had weathered a storm in the same boat. Maggie approached the podium first. She looked out at the reporters, her silver hair catching the light, her eyes bright with a fire that hadn't been there a month ago. For 30 years, Adams Real Estate has been a fortress, she began, her voice steady and resonant. And for 30 years, Kim Global has been an empire. We were told that for these two entities to coexist, one had to consume the other. We were told that power is a zero-sum game. She paused, looking to her side. Téjun stepped forward, his hand finding hers in front of every camera in the city. There was a collective gasp from the crowd, the wow moment for the public. We are here to announce that there will be no merger, Téjun said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had reclaimed his soul. Instead, we have formed the Adams-Kim partnership. It is a union of equals. In business, yes, but more importantly, in life. At 60, Maggie added, her voice softening but losing none of its strength, you realize that a legacy isn't built of glass and steel. It's built of the people who stand beside you when the lights go out. Téjun Kim is my partner in every sense of the word, and we are just getting started. An hour later, the cameras were gone. The building was empty, the staff sent home for a week of paid leave to celebrate the new era. Maggie and Téjun stood on the private balcony of her penthouse. 60 stories above the city they had both, in their own ways, conquered. The Chicago wind was cold, but the heat between them was a physical thing. Téjun stood behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, breathing in the scent of her perfume. You know, he murmured, the agency is going to be very confused when they see the final report. We broke every rule in the placeholder handbook. I think we should sue them for emotional distress, Maggie joked, leaning her head back against him. They promised me a sophisticated academic. Instead, I got a reclusive tiger who likes to record my board meetings. Téjun turned her in his arms, his expression becoming serious. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. When he opened it, there was no prop ring inside. It was a band of hammered platinum, simple and timeless. No more faking, Maggie, he said. I don't want to be your hired husband. I don't want to be your rival. I just want to be the man who makes sure the silence in this apartment never hurts again. Maggie looked at the ring, then up at the man who had seen her at her most vulnerable and her most vicious, and loved both versions. She didn't hesitate. She didn't calculate the optics. Put it on, she whispered. As he slid the ring onto her finger, the city of Chicago glittered below them, a kingdom they would rule together. The final shot was not of two CEOs closing a deal, but of two people who had spent 60 years finding their way to each other, finally standing in the light, no longer faking a single thing. The flight from Chicago had been a blur of champagne and quiet conversation in the private cabin, but as the wheels of the Gulf Stream touched down at Incheon, the reality of their new life settled in. Seoul was a neon-veined labyrinth of glass and history, a city that moved at a speed even Maggie found exhilarating. But Téjun didn't take her to the Kim Global skyscraper, nor to the sprawling family estate in Hanam-dong that he had once described as a gilded cage. Instead, he directed the driver to a traditional hanok, a beautifully restored wooden villa tucked away in the quiet hills of Bukchon. I thought you were a man of glass and steel, Maggie remarked as they stepped onto the polished wood of the courtyard. The air here smelled of damp earth and pine, a stark contrast to the sterile scent of her Chicago penthouse. I was, Téjun replied, watching the moon hang low over the curved tile roofs. But I wanted the first place you saw in my country to be somewhere the walls don't have ears, somewhere we are just Maggie and Téjun. Later that night, the city's roar was a distant hum. Inside the villa, the floor was warmed by traditional ondel heating, and the sliding paper doors were thrown open to a private garden where a single maple tree stood like a sentry. Maggie emerged from the bath, wrapped in a silk robe the color of crushed plums. She found Téjun sitting on the edge of the low platform bed, staring out at the garden. He had shed the Titan entirely. In his simple linen loungewear, his silver hair slightly damp, he looked younger, more vulnerable. She walked over and stood between his knees. Téjun immediately wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face against her stomach. He let out a long, shuddering breath. It feels different here, he whispered into the silk. Being home with you, it's like seeing the city in color for the first time. Maggie ran her fingers through his hair, her touch slow and rhythmic. You were so afraid to come back. You thought the ghosts of your past would ruin what we have." Téjun looked up at her, his dark eyes shimmering with a raw, mature honesty. "I was afraid I wouldn't be enough without the towers, that once you saw the man behind the tiger, you'd realize you'd made a bad investment." Maggie leaned down, her lips brushing his forehead before she looked him squarely in the eye. "Téjun, I've spent my life valuing assets. I know exactly what you're worth, and you're priceless." She pushed him back gently onto the bed, crawling over him with a grace that defied their 60 years. The intimacy between them was no longer a discovery, it was a deepening. It wasn't the frantic heat of youth, but something more profound, a slow-burning fire that prioritized the lingering touch, the way his thumb traced the line of her jaw, the way she hummed into the hollow of his throat. In the quiet of the soul night, they moved together with a profound, unhurried, synchronized rhythm. Every kiss was a promise kept. Every touch was a bridge over the decades they had spent alone. There were no boardrooms here, no tickers, no rivals. There was only the sound of their breathing and the rustle of silk against skin. Afterward, as they lay tangled together under the heavy down duvet, Téjun reached for her hand, bringing her knuckles to his lips. "Tomorrow, I have to introduce you to my children," he said, his voice low. "They agreed to dinner. They want to meet the woman who tamed the tiger." Maggie smiled, a wicked glint in her eyes. "Should I tell them I'm a hired professional, or should I tell them the truth?" Téjun laughed, a deep, soulful sound that echoed in the quiet garden. He pulled her closer, his chin resting on top of her head. "Tell them the truth," he whispered. "Tell them you're the CEO of my heart. I think they'll find that much more terrifying." As Maggie drifted off to sleep in the heart of Seoul, she realized the merger was finally complete. Not of companies, and not of legacies, but of two souls who had finally found home in each other. The end. Thank you for watching. If you love this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more emotional twists and character-driven plots. And if you're ready for the next story, make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Until next time, keep believing in love that defies all odds.